cannabis to produce an effect throughout virtually the entire brain. The major, and in some cases, we've got a higher density where it's a warmer colors, more like a red. That's a higher density of CB1 receptors. And, it goes for virtually the entire brain with the exception of sort of down at the bottom right of the brain. You'll notice there's a little bit of tissue, and that's our brainstem. And this is one of the reasons why people can't overdose on cannabis, because we don't have receptors at the brainstem. This is going to make overdose very, 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 very difficult. That's not to say that cannabis can't be harmful, that cannabis use can't lead to death or injury, but it won't be through overdose the same way we see with, say, alcohol or opioids, where there's a lot of receptors at the brainstem. The other thing I will point out is these, as I said, these CB1 receptors are really where we see the cannabis producing its effect. And for those of you familiar with the brain, these CB1 receptors, they tend to be more at the presynaptic sites. So they're going to affect the release of neurotransmitters, these chemicals in the brain that allow neurons to talk to each other. It's going to happen at the CB1 receptors tend to be on the presynaptic sites and affect the release of the neurotransmitters, as opposed to sort of mimicking neurotransmitters the way that, say, nicotine might mimic acetylcholine. So that's sort of our, a bit of a foundation about cannabis, a little bit of information about how it works. But to me, I think one of the most interesting things about cannabis isn't so much, telling you about cannabis and telling you, we could go into all these scientific facts. But one of the most interesting things is the misinformation about cannabis. Cannabis is, to me, a really misunderstood drug. And a lot of times people sort of have beliefs about cannabis that really don't jibe with what we know in the research. And so if you'll indulge me, I've picked out 4 myths about cannabis. And I've picked these specific, because they are relatively prevalent. We know that these are things that people often believe, but I've also picked them because I teach drugs and behavior at the Mount. And these are myths that have come up in class, whether it be in class or before or after class when talking to students. These are things that people have actually said to me. And so it sort of speaks to the fact that these myths are out there. So the first I'll bring up is the idea that cannabis isn't harmful because it's natural, right? It's a plant, it grows free, it's under the right conditions, it's organic, therefore it can't be harmful. But I would, at a very basic level, counter, just because something's natural doesn't mean it's not harmful. If probably not in the winter, but if in the summer you came across poison ivy, you wouldn't pick that up and start rubbing it on your skin saying, oh no, it's natural, don't worry, it'll be fine. Equally, the venom from this rattlesnake, we could describe as entirely natural. In fact, if you were to bottle it, you could potentially sell that as certified organic rattlesnake venom. However, despite the fact that it's natural, it is obviously harmful. So just because something's natural doesn't mean it's not harmful. As far as the specific harms that we see from marijuana, well, there's a couple of different ones. I'll start with the lungs. And I think, at a really basic level, we can nitpick, we can split hairs as to, which is more harmful and which isn't. But I think, if we really start thinking about smoking marijuana the same way we think about smoking cigarettes, that's probably about right. Though in truth, you could potentially make an argument that marijuana is more harmful. So for example, we know that a marijuana joint has double the tar of a cigarette. And because of that, because of the lack of filter that tends to go along with it, but also too because of the way that people tend to smoke marijuana by inhaling and holding the smoke in there for a longer period of time. It actually deposits 4 times the amount of tar compared to a cigarette. So, from that perspective, as far as sort of the ability to deposit that tar that makes our lungs turn black, that can impede oxygen exchange, marijuana, it can be really quite harmful. And apart from the tar, we know that marijuana contains a lot of the same cancer-causing toxins that we see in cigarettes. And in fact, depending on the toxin you're looking at, it could be up to 50 to 75% more toxins compared to a cigarette. So we're getting a lot of these same sorts of things. Now, the flip side of that is that people often don't smoke joints with the same frequency that they would smoke cigarettes. And that may be true. So that might mitigate some of that. But again, if you think of how often someone's going to smoke compared to, as I was saying, 4 times the tar, 50 to 75% cancer-causing chemicals, obviously there's quite a bit of potential for harm to the lungs. And this is true whether or not people are using a joint, a marijuana cigarette. This is true if people are using water bongs. I have had at least one student say to me, well, the water, running the smoke through the water, it purifies the smoke, it cleans the smoke. So therefore it's, it's better for me when it gets to me. And to a certain extent, they may be right, because some of the smoke is going to get trapped in the water. And so it's going to make it potentially less efficient. But nonetheless, smoke is smoke is smoke. The other thing we need to think about when we talk about smoke with marijuana is not just the smoker themselves, but the people around the smoker. So if we're talking about cigarettes, for example, we know that only about 1/3 of the smoke from a cigarette goes to the smoker. 2/3 goes to the atmosphere around the smoker. And the same is true of a joint. Only about 1/3 of the smoke is going to go to the smoker. 2/3 is going to end up around the smoker. So that means that people around the smoker are going to be exposed to the same tar, to the same cancer-causing chemicals, and potentially to the same THC. Though it is worth noting that you tend to have to be in a fairly tight, poorly ventilated space in order for that contact high, that high from secondhand smoke to really come in. And again, part of that is, it's not because people aren't breathing in the smoke, they are, but they tend to be holding it in less. And because the THC is relatively slow to pass through the membranes and into the bloodstream, that's going to be one of the reasons for that. But nonetheless, we're seeing potential lung-related harms with marijuana. And so again, I think it's probably reasonable to think of it at least as being in the same ballpark as cigarettes as far as those harms go. The other one, and to be honest, the one that interests me more, is the potential harms to the brain. And I've saved some of you, as I was talking about, a joint versus secondhand smoke versus a bong, might have said, well, what about vaping? What about if someone puts their marijuana into a vaporizer? Wouldn't that get rid of some of the tar and some of the cancer-causing chemicals? And absolutely, it's better than smoking a cigarette, but pyrolysis can still occur, and that can still produce some of these harmful chemicals, albeit in a levels less than what we see with a marijuana cigarette. But when we talk about the brain, so that applies to the lungs. When we talk about the brain really doesn't care how the THC gets into your bloodstream. It doesn't care whether or not you smoked a joint or vaporized it or even injected it. The THC is THC as far as the effects on the brain goes, although the dosing might be different. So one thing that we know is that repeated use of cannabis has been linked to the death of cells in the brain. And if you think back to that image of where we have CB1 receptors, where marijuana is going to produce its effects, virtually everywhere we have receptors is the range of areas where we might see cell death. So basically the entire brain. But we don't see this effect. And if I'm being honest, that's theoretical. No one's really checked, region by region by region by region. But in theory, we could get cell death throughout nearly the entire brain. Where we tend to see the greatest effect, though, tends to be in those parts of the brain where we've got the greatest density of CB1 receptors. So we have, for example, the hippocampus. Hippocampi, we've got two hippocampi, one left hemisphere, one right hemisphere. For those of you either familiar with now that being said, I'm not sure if it's Latin or Greek, but your ancient languages, and or have read the Percy Jackson books, you might recognize the hippocampus means seahorse. And that's because if you were to actually dissect a brain and pull out the hippocampus, it looks quite a bit like a seahorse. As far as the effects of, or what the hippocampus does, it does a huge range of things. We primarily associate it with memory. And so cannabis's effects on hippocampus have been linked to some of the memory effects, whether it be, difficulties with short-term memory, and particularly that conversion of short-term memory to long-term memory. But the hippocampus does so much more. It's involved in spatial navigation. It's involved in coordinating our stress response. So anything that's going to start to cause damage to the hippocampus and cause the volume, the size of the hippocampus to start to shrink is potentially going to have a wide range of effects. And certainly we know that in those who are heavy chronic users, we tend to see reduction of hippocampus. Now there's a couple of different parts to that. Firstly, the higher the THC that the person tends to smoke, the greater the reduction we tend to see. The other thing that's worth noting is sometimes people will say, well, someone who's using cannabis might be using other drugs. Maybe, some might be. But we actually see this in users without polydrug use as well. So it suggests that cannabis is producing this effect as well. We also see effects in areas like basal ganglia. Basal ganglia involved in motivated behavior, goal-directed behavior. And so then that's the brain region that sort of links cannabis's association with sort of amotivational states. So overall, we're seeing, yes, it's natural, but yes, there are also potential harms, whether it be, potential harms to the lungs or harms to the brain. Our next myth then is this idea that you can't get addicted to marijuana. And this is my slide that I use with kids, but I think it conveys the facts here that about 1 in 11 people who use marijuana, any use, are going to get addicted. And I realize 1 in 11, it's kind of a meaningless stat without context. To put it in context, about 1 in 10 people who use alcohol will get addicted. And so just as we know that people can get addicted to alcohol, people can get addicted to marijuana as well. And if we think about this from a brain-based perspective, we know that marijuana, at least indirectly, causes release of dopamine in our reward pathways. So areas like ventral tegmental area or nucleus accumbens with THC, well, and when I say marijuana, with THC, we're going to get release of dopamine in these pathways, which the brain tends to find rewarding. And that rewarding aspect tends to be associated with the development of dependence. Worth noting that we see this in animals as well. If we look at rat or mouse models, we see this. However, it is dose dependent. With low THC doses, the animals don't find it very rewarding at all. But with the higher THC doses, they tend to show more of those behaviors that indicate that they like it a lot and they would like to get more of it. The other side, though, of dependence isn't just because, and certainly we know that people, finding a drug rewarding is going to be part of dependence. Another part of it then are the withdrawal effects, the sort of side effects as, THC is leaving the system or if people aren't getting their regular dose. And for years, people didn't realize that marijuana produced physical side effects because they're less obvious. I sometimes describe them as sneaky side effects.